Hey guys, so last couple of videos we focused on the events of June 26th of 1863 and Early's raid on Gettysburg. So now we're going to focus on the events of the 27th, 28th, 29th, and 30th of June leading up to the actual battle. So after Early's raid on Gettysburg on June 26th, his division continued to move east, with Gordon's brigade following along what is today Route 30 through New Oxford and Abbottstown, and the main body, which was actually north of Gordon's brigade, following what is most likely today's Route 234 through Hampton and East Berlin. As Early's division continued to move east towards their objective of York, north of Gettysburg, Robert Rodes' division was actually on the move towards Carlisle. Now, the main objective was for Rodes to take Carlisle and Early to take York, and then both were to make a move on Harrisburg. Rodes would actually attempt to move east on Harrisburg, while Early would cross the river at Wrightsville and then move north to take Harrisburg from the south. Rodes would take Carlisle on June 27th, while Early walked into York on June 28th. York was actually the largest city in the north to fall under the Confederate flag. They actually had a tribute that the Confederate Army wanted. They wanted a sum of $100,000, but they only were able to get around $28,000 from the citizens and shopkeepers of York. Meanwhile, while all this was going on, the Army of the Potomac was making slow progress against Lee's army. They actually crossed the Potomac River on June 26th, while Lee's army was well within the borders of Pennsylvania. The Army continued to make slow progress, and Commanding General Hooker was actually trying to get a garrison of forces around 10,000 men from Harper's Ferry, because he believed that Lee's force was actually larger than what it really was. Well, his attempts were denied repeatedly by General-in-Chief Halleck and President Lincoln. This would lead Hooker to resign from commanding general. This put Lincoln in a situation. He had to scramble to find a new commander on the eve of battle. He asked several commanders, including 1st Corps Commander John F. Reynolds, before settling on 5th Corps Commander George Gordon Meade. Meade would waste no time. He would move his army in the direction of Pennsylvania after he took command on the 28th of June. He had a decent idea of where Lee was, but he had no idea what Lee's intentions were. So he had his army deployed pretty wide, in a wide front, ready to protect Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Washington if need be, but also with some corps probing to try to find areas of where the Army of Northern Virginia could be going. By the end of the day on the 29th of June, Meade had 2 corps below Emmitsburg and 1 below Taneytown, with the remainder around Uniontown and Westminster. While Meade was organizing and deploying his forces, Lee was on the move as well. Early's attempt to cross the Susquehanna was abandoned at Wrightsville, east of York, when after some fighting around between Gordon's brigade and militia, the militia would set fire to the bridge, forcing Gordon back to York. Now, the supports for this bridge are actually still there. The best view to actually get them would be to travel Route 30, cross the Wrightsville Bridge towards Columbia, and look to your right. You could actually see pillars standing out of the water of the river. Those are actually the pillars from that bridge. Now, it was rebuilt several times since the war, but the supports that are still there are still the original supports. They actually sit beside the bridge for Route 462, which is just south of the Route 30 bridge, but you can see it better from the Route 30 side. Anyway, while Early was being repelled, Rodes was in action as well. They would actually fight some at Sporting Hill, not far from Camp Hill, having some casualties and such. And while that was going on, south of the Mason-Dixon line, Jeb Stuart's cavalry were engaged at Westminster before turning north. While all this was going on, Lee received reports that the Union Army had crossed the Potomac and was closing in. So this forced Lee to abandon all of his plans. His plan was to take Harrisburg, but he had to abandon it. He then ordered his army to concentrate around the Gettysburg Cashtown area. So Early's division turned around from York, went through Dover and down, while Rhodes came down from Carlisle. They would actually start moving out on the morning of June 30th. As Lee began to concentrate, Meade began to tighten his front to a length of 20 miles, with the 1st, 11th, and 3rd Corps massing around Emmitsburg. While the infantry moved, the cavalry was busy. Just a few miles southwest of Gettysburg, elements of Judson Kilpatrick's division went to battle against Jeb Stuart's cavalry at Hanover. Kilpatrick was the main division commander, but there was another big name that was going to be in there who would etch his name in history several years later in Montana. George Armstrong Custer was the commander of the Michigan Wolverines, and they were deployed in Hanover. They would eventually push Jeb Stuart's cavalry back. Jeb Stuart would eventually have to go to Jefferson and then try to link up with Lee's army, but he would actually move very far away from Lee's army before he would actually eventually link up. So, as this was going on in Hanover, there was some probing going on around Gettysburg. There was a brigade under Johnston Pettigrew, who was under Heath's division, was moving east from Cashtown towards Gettysburg. Now, the story goes that they were actually going to search for shoes and so forth in the town. There's two things that go against this. Gettysburg did not have a shoe factory. In fact, the nearest shoe factory would not be founded until 1899, many years after the battle. It would actually be founded in Hanover. Another factor that goes into why this is kind of hazy on what his real intentions were, supplies were going to be scarce. Early's division just invaded several days before, so it's very unlikely that they would have gotten any supplies. Well, they never reached Gettysburg. They were only a few miles outside of town, and then they looked to the south, and they saw a column of blue horsemen coming up the road from Fairfield. This forced Johnston Pettigrew to turn his brigade around and head back to Cashtown. The horsemen they saw was Buford's cavalry. He had two brigades of his 1st Division, Colonels Gamble and Devon, coming up the road, and they would go through town to much fanfare from the citizens, and they would stop just west of town along McPherson's Ridge. This area would be where Buford would make a fateful decision. The topography south of town, which had hills that would have names etched in history forever, served as a good defensive area for fighting operations. So Buford decided to deploy his forces north, west, and northeast of town, covering where they could make contact with the Confederate Army. Setting up his headquarters at the Eagle Hotel at the corner of Washington and Chambersburg Street, which is where the 7-Eleven is now across from Ernie's Texas Lunch, Buford would send messages that he intended to hold Gettysburg. After being forced back to Cashtown, Pettigrew went to Division Commander Henry Heath and Corps Commander A.P. Hill, reporting of a Federal force in town. Hill was not thoroughly convinced, and he ordered Heath's division forward to perform a reconnaissance in force for the next morning. But little did they know that what awaited them just 8 miles down the road. But that is a story for another time.